Раз есть и в государствах.
As a follow-up to the previous lecture, let us formulate the dangers that society faces. In the picture, we see that the dangers can be of a military nature, weapons of destruction, the dangers of destroying the gene pool, that is, everything related to health, which is a question of the reproduction of generations. This also includes all kinds of food additives, food safety, cosmetics, and so on. An economic danger is first of all usury, loan interest, as a means of a structureless method of governance over countries and nations. A technological danger is a technology for fooling people around, manipulation of consciousness, and not only consciousness, but also technical means that can harm the development of mankind. Technological dangers include religions, ideologies, systems, teachings, cults, and the list goes on and on. By the way, we are now adopting a law on extremism. What is extremism? Nobody gives an exact definition. Like, there is something there, somewhere over there, when someone... That is, there is no clear measure of understanding. They do not endow it with a clear measure of understanding. But if we consider it from the standpoint of the conception of social safety, then Isaiah's Deuteronomy is definitely such an act of extremism. And thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. The Church considers this abomination to be God's revelation, that it is from God. For such a wording, one should actually be prosecuted. But in reality, it is not they who are prosecuted, but those who dare to say that this is all an abomination. Following the subject, I can say that Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy wrote a very good work, Pauline Christianity. Why Christian peoples in general, and especially the Russian people, are now in a dire situation, where he exposed the falsity of Christian teaching, not the teaching of Jesus Christ himself, but precisely the teaching of the Church. After all, the teaching of Christ was altered by the agent of the Sanhedrin named Paul Sewell, who became an apostle. Paul Sewell's contemporaries called his teaching Pauline Christianity. That is, he began to preach this teaching, having distorted the true teaching of Jesus Christ. This is all described in great detail in the conception of social safety, in the work of the internal predictor of the USSR, The Master and Margarita, an anthem to demonism, or a gospel of selfless faith. But Pauline Christianity, Isaiah's Deuteronomy, and many other things are not considered dangers, since they are supposed to be accepted, normal things. Tolstoy said that a lie never ceases to be a lie just because millions of people are guided by it. It was an accepted thing that the earth was flat on 3 elephants and a turtle. Then another accepted thing came along. So what if Christianity is now accepted with all this abomination? In the conception of social safety, all these ideological, methodological and other ulcers are exposed, lies are exposed, and the conception says how it should be. We are now going through a period of another debunking of myths. We, theoretically speaking, are in the process of transition from the theory of the flat earth on 3 elephants and a turtle to the comprehending realization of the fact that the earth is spherical and revolves around the sun. And everything passes, as in that Russian song. At first it is scary, then the fear passes. The next danger is the chronological historical danger. These are all sorts of historical myths that cause inversions in people's understanding of historical processes. Again, I have a lot of facts. I have enough facts. I'm full of facts, but I'm poor methodologically. That is how one can look at these facts. This determines everything. If the author of a historical work does not have, in the circle of his understandings, the concepts of governance of global historical processes, governance in general, the implementation of concentration of governance of productive forces of humanity, global politics, and so on, then, whether he wants it or not, he will create another myth that the global mafia can use if the need arises. But we say that in principle, it is impossible to describe all facts, therefore, they should be viewed from the standpoint of governance over these facts. And we know that governance is always carried out according to the certain conception, and processes should be considered as processes taking place in supersystems. It means that it is necessary to make available ways and methods of governance, including structureless ones, which are set out in the sufficiently general theory of governance, which is not taught anywhere. Well, and finally, the highest danger to man is the worldview and methodological danger. A person with a false and erroneous worldview is a danger for himself. In addition, the conception of governance and basic philosophy are formed at this priority. If a person has an erroneous worldview and philosophy, then he can be manipulated. So people were given the philosophy of matter, energy, space, time, on the basis of which people are manipulated, but they do not know anything else. The alternative is the philosophy of MIM, matter information measure, which implies the mastery of the sufficiently general theory of governance and constant contact with the Creator in life. In this case, the highest methodological priority allows a person to consciously correlate to everything that happens around him, and it will be impossible to manipulate such a person. From all that has been said, it is important to understand that threats, dangers are different, and not only material, and a person should always analyze the general situation from the perspective of all the priorities. Then he will have a complete or close to a complete picture. Therefore, Russians should not be intimidated by the threat of NATO approaching their borders. After all, there are more threats than that. Putin is right when he says that we need to join NATO. There is no need to be afraid of NATO. Look, we had an indestructible and legendary Red Army. There were the countries of the Warsaw Pact. And where is this all now? Destroyed. How? It was done on the highest priorities of generalized means of governance. That is, they took us without a hot war. Knowing the priorities allows you to understand how all this is done. How did they take us? They did it by getting us drunk, through the financial credit system, deceptions and purposeful distortions of history. In this case, how can we overcome all these negative governing impacts? Only by rising higher to the worldview methodological priority. It is also necessary to give this worldview to the whole world at international scientific conferences. We also have to talk about the law of time with the understanding about governance of global historical processes. We need to discuss the topics on religions, their roles in governance, reveal all kinds of lies. For example, we tell Muslims that they do not live according to the Quran. The Quran, Surah 2, Ayat 275 says, "Those who swallow usury will not rise, except as someone driven mad by Satan's touch." That is because they say, commerce is like usury, but God has permitted commerce and has forbidden usury. Whoever, on receiving advice from his Lord, refrains, may keep his past earnings, and his case rests with God. But whoever resumes, these are the dwellers of the fire, wherein they will abide forever. Surah 4, ayats 160-161 say, "Due to wrongdoing on the part of the Jews, we forbade them good things that used to be lawful for them, and for deterring many from God's path, and for their taking usury, although they were forbidden it, and for their consuming people's wealth dishonestly. We have prepared for the faithless among them a painful torment." So, are you Muslims engaged in usury? So, guys like Osama bin Laden, where did he keep his money? In the Bank of Switzerland. So, how is he a Muslim then? The Quran, Surah 3, ayat 104 says, "And let there be among you a community calling to virtue, and advocating righteousness, and deterring from evil. These are the successful." What is a community? In other words, it turns out that the Quran speaks of true communism. So the Quran contains such an understanding. This is what, in general terms, we need to talk about to the entire world community. And then the problems are solved. The same applies to the Bible. We must say what in it is from God and what is not from God. Only afterwards, all these accumulated contradictions can be solved, since all these contradictions are created purposefully in order to implement the principle of divide, pit against each other, and conquer. So, there are external threats and internal threats, dangers. As one classic said, there is nothing worse than grazing, herding one's own fools. You know, we have such fools in our country that can surprise anyone. A clear stratification of generalized means of governance allows you to understand many things. In addition, through this prism, one can view previous historical events, historical disputes, the collapse of states and empires, the annexation of states. And it becomes clear that not a single empire fell apart just somehow by itself. Any collapse of an empire was the result of a very specific governance. The process of concentration of governance of productive forces of humanity was unfolding, and this process proceeded according to the certain conception of governance, and all historical events were inscribed in it. Now, through the types of power and the priorities of generalized means, it is possible to draw a diagram of how the global predictor governed and still governs over countries and nations. Well, here is a reminder. Remember first, conceptual, ideological, legislative, executive and judicial powers. In this picture we can see there is state X, which has state bodies, which in their turn rule a society. And this has a result. There is always some kind of result, no matter what, just an abstract result. The carrier of conceptual power evaluates this result that comes via the feedback lines. How does the global predictor affect the state? Possessing conceptual power, the global predictor, through the pluralism of ideologies, influences government agencies, bodies, where there is confusion in the minds. Everyone is at odds with one another. Next comes legislative power. Government agencies invent laws based on a certain conception, about which they know nothing. Let's just say, imagine a situation where we are developing a tax law. If, in my understanding, people should live well, then a certain tax must be adopted, while another one may have a different view on people, who in his turn adopts such a law that does not essentially express the interests of people. That is, people, when adopting and inventing laws, are guided by their conception, by which they live, regardless of whether they know about conceptual power or not, whether they consciously follow the conception or not. To say it differently, people are guided by their own ideals, and the power over these ideals belongs to the conception. And what is the conception like? I'm the smartest, and the rest are all idiots. So I will parasitize them. That is, this is the conception of the world slave system. In total, there are two conceptions. One is previous, the other is unprevious. The unprevious conception is of two types, open and hidden. Therefore, many manipulators implement and adhere to the unprevious conception of a hidden nature, in which, in words, information by announcement, therefore justice, privacy, but in reality they are no better than those who openly advocate the unprevious conception. They stand for justice, privacy, but by default, in the informational background, it turns out that they want to reign over the rest, who should come to them, and these guys want to tell the rest what is previous and what is not. So it is hidden slavery, nothing more. To summarize, one conception is previous and the other is unprevious, either openly or in a hidden way. Now the question is, which form of the unprevious conception is more dangerous? The hidden one, of course. As for the openly unprevious conception, people can handle it easily. But how can one figure out about the conception that, by announcement, have good intentions, but by default, the opposite? So, under the guise of good slogans, intentions, one can do one's job. Moreover, special attention should be paid to the fact that when the carriers of one or another unprevious conception sincerely follow it, then even for active followers of this ideology, the hidden essence remains unknown. This happens. So it is impossible not to be held hostage by the conception, even if a person has never heard of conceptual power. A person always expresses one or another conception in any action he carries out, and he can be a mere tool in the hands of a conception. So, all laws are invented from the perspective of the conception. While executive power implements the adopted legislation, and judicial power keeps order and factually protects the existing conception. Further on, the global predictor exerts an impact on state X on the basis of generalized means of governance. In addition, governance is carried out in structural and structureless ways. In other words, through education system, the first priority, the erroneous methodology is given to people. The pluralism of opinions and kaleidoscopic idiocy are brought into the minds of people through the system of preschool, school, primary, secondary, higher and academic education. After all, there are historical myths. Who propagates these myths? School teachers, professors do. So, what do we have? It turns out that the education system is a tool for governing and implementing alien conceptual power. The same concerns all kinds of political parties. They themselves do not understand that they work for those who know and understand more, since they implement the principle of divide, pit, and conquer. Speaking of the economy, the same principle works against firms, companies, enterprises, and so on, which hustle and bustle about, trying to do business and do not know that they are doomed. The healthcare system is the fifth priority. As soon as there appears money between the doctor and the patient, there can be no health care. All this is doomed. Moreover, the fact that the medical treatment of man belongs to different fields of medicine is kaleidoscopic nonsense. Look, we have doctors for the eyes, doctors for the ears, doctors for the heart, doctors for the teeth, doctors for something else, and each doctor is responsible for some part of a person. But doctors do not know the person as a whole, as a holistic organism. After all, a person functions as a whole and not partially. Such a separate study could take place if each separate part of man function separately and independently of the other parts. But in practice, in life, hardly anyone will argue that all parts of the human body are interconnected and interdependent in a strict, determined way. But it is precisely these connections that are not studied as a whole, so that the whole organism is known as a whole. All doctors around the world only specialize in different parts of the human body. But the treatment of a person and the preservation of his health should be approached from a holistic standpoint. Here is the principle of divide, pit, and conquer, on the example of medicine and the fifth priority. And what do we have to understand in this case? Is a person material? Yes, he is material. Does he possess an informational state? Yes, he does. And a person has a matrix measure, which determines the state of a person's matter and information. All diseases come from the mismatch of the measure matrix of a person with the measure matrix of God. When a person does not live in harmony with God, then his particular measure is violated. All this is reflected in the material carrier, the human body, in the form of diseases. There is something else that should be said concerning the fifth priority, in particular about medicine. We've already said that in creation, there is a concept of thin, subtle matter in visible worlds. That is matter, the frequency indicators of which are so high that the human eye is not able to catch them. We also said that in creation, information is objective and is recorded on matter, both coarse matter and subtle matter. There is information in a person, as in everything in creation. Information from biochemical processes in the body is recorded at a coarse bodily level. Meanwhile, informational flows of psychic processes require large frequency characteristics of matter, and subtle matter is best suited for this. People have subtle matter, which is a bifield. However, modern science claims that all matter in creation oscillates except for a person, and this is what proves schizophrenia of modern science. But this schizophrenia leads to the fact that human biofield health is ignored and not studied. Summing up what has been said, one should summarize the necessary changes in medicine. Body physiology should be studied along with the whole human body in their entireties. Biofield human physiology should be studied at the scientific level. Their relationship and interdependence of bodily and biofield physiology should be studied. Therefore, the entire healthcare system must be completely different. Moreover, most efforts should be directed to ensuring that a person does not get sick at all. Everyone has to know the interconnections and interdependence of bodily and biofield physiologies. Medicine should not be aimed at endlessly healing the consequences of a person's illness, but at the true causes of his illness, which are both bodily and physiological in nature. But all this requires appropriate upbringing, rearing education, food culture, culture of behavior, and so on. The total physiological ignorance of most people should be rooted out, when they do not even know who they really are. In general, this is something to ponder on. And here is the final priority, the sixth one, which is used in the case when something needs to be quickly resolved. For example, when a leader begins to do the wrong thing, then a coup d'etat is arranged, the leader or the entire government is replaced. And it turns out that we seem to elect presidents, parties, governments, and so on. But in fact, it does not solve anything. All this is inscribed in the alien conceptual power. Therefore, you will not achieve anything in your country, you will not solve any problems or issues if you do not change the current conception to the previous one. But the good news is that the law of time, objectively independent of any human being phenomenon, contributes to this transition. Here is another scheme of governance, which reveals some of the nuances. There is the global predictor, the conceptual power, and there is state X, where there are government agencies and a society. And through conceptual, ideological, legislative, executive, judicial powers, governance is carried out. What nature of governance is it? Unstable. It is difficult for an ordinary person to grasp because he wants stability in all spheres of life. But the global predictor does not need such stability. They want to keep ordinary people swinging on a pendulum between opposites all the time: war, peace, good, bad, because this makes it easier to reign over people. This is how the principle of divide, beat and conquer is implemented. In the picture, you see that this red arrow means that society is moving here and there. There is no stability. The global predictor does not need state bodies to be strengthened, because state bodies then will be able to carry out their own state policy in the interest of their state. We have already examined the correlation between global, domestic and foreign politics. And we know that the global predictor implements global politics, while elites of countries and states conduct internal and external policies. The global predictor made a decision to dismember the USSR and Russia, so that the state structure in Russia would not come to an understanding of global politics. By the way, speaking of Stalin, he managed to come to an understanding of global politics, and therefore himself carried out a global policy. So the USSR was dismembered. Now they are trying to dismember Russia. Exactly the same scenario awaits the United States. How do transnational corporations and transnational banks govern the United States? They do it through a bipartisan system, the Republicans and the Democrats. Imagine that we are that very mafia, the global predictor. There are many countries and states, and we cannot tell them directly what to do. It is necessary to form the illusion that government agencies and people determine everything themselves. This is done by dividing the national economic complex of a country into two parts. After all, people produce commodities, trade with each other. So in principle, all branches of the national economy can be reduced to two parts. The first part is a raw material production complex. The second part is a manufacturing processing complex that produces all kinds of goods and services. The raw material complex has such a mentality that the main thing is that oil pumps should pump oil, and that's it. And in the manufacturing industries, a rapid change in technology is required in order to sell goods, track the demand, and other indicators of market dynamics. We consider this on the example of fashion. That is, in order to sell a product, you have to constantly offer something new. So the mentality of those involved in the manufacturing industries is more dynamic. Therefore, the question is how to rule, how to pit these industries against each other. We, being that mafia, can do it through the difference of interests. And this difference of interests in the United States is expressed by the parties. For example, in the United States, the interests of the raw material industries are expressed by the Republican Party, and the interests of the manufacturing industries are expressed by the Democratic Party. It should be understood that the names of the parties have no meaning. And at every moment, depending on the current particular tasks, a certain maneuver is held in the United States, and a candidate is brought to power through election procedures for 4 years. Why 4 years? Because after 4 years have passed, the leader may begin to understand something. Therefore, such rulers, as soon as they gain some experience and may begin to understand something, they must be removed and new ones must be elected, who also do not understand anything. And to support all these processes, the people are imposed with the thought that the government should be changed, that every 4 years the leader of the state should be changed, as they say, we have democracy, and so on. Why should it be changed? Let's look at it from the following standpoint. Here is a shoemaker. He is getting better from year to year, acquiring more and more professionalism. As for governance, those who are involved in it also gain professionalism from year to year and acquire qualifications. Then why do we have to change a ruler who rules so well? And elective procedures only contribute to this. They remove one and bring to power another. What else should one also understand? In the example of the USA, it is also important to understand that those who represent the interests of the raw material complex bring the Republicans to power when the need for some stability arises. When it is necessary to do something quickly, change something, carry out some reforms, then the Democrats, like Clinton, are brought to power, and both the complexes and the parties are governed structurelessly. For example, how was Clinton governed? Well, the whole country of the US, to be precise, all of humanity knows that he turned the Oval Office into the oral one, thanks to Monica Lewinsky. Clinton had a dossier with black spots and weak points, thanks to which he could be manipulated at any moment, in case he started to rock the boat in the wrong direction. So when needed, he was manipulated, as a result of which Clinton bombed Belgrade. If he hadn't done this, then something concerning his career would have been announced. In other words, it is an outright blackmail. Such people like Clinton are given hints of what to do and how to do it. Such people like him have no official superiors who have the formal authority to issue orders to them, but they are manipulated through hints structurelessly. How was Bush governed? You remember how he dodged the war in Iraq. He understood the consequences. Clinton was a moron, but Bush was not such a moron. He understood some things. Can you imagine what it means to get involved in a war with the Islamic world? This was what the global mafia needed. They organized the attack of Boeings on the skyscrapers in New York. Further on, the people and these thoughtless journalists, in a probabilistic, predetermined way, stirred up the situation, and the leader of the country was forced to take the opinion and the wish of the masses into account. Further, how does one become president in the US? Here comes the candidate and says, I will raise your salaries. So people vote for him. 4 years pass, a new candidate comes and says, I will increase your pensions. And the people again go to polling stations. Thanks to this false system in the United States, there are unemployed people who have left our country for the United States, and they live on welfare there better without working than if they worked there. Now the question is, do the global predictor need non-working slaves? No, of course not. In addition, 5% of the world's population lives in the United States and consumes almost 50% of the energy resources produced by all of humanity. And if all of humanity lives according to the American model, then the entire planet will suck out the resources within a few years. Do the global predictor need all this? No. The global predictor themselves created this project, so they themselves will have to destroy it. And what is the global predictor trying to do in our country with the heads of our mindless rulers? It is the same thing that we are talking about, a two-party system. Now they are trying to create a two-party system from the United Russia Party. But they aren't able to fulfill this whole thing in our country. Why? by virtue of the law of time. After all, how did the United Russia Party take shape? When our country was being plundered, this was under the influence of three main clans: the Yeltsin family, the regional clans, and the Lushkov clan. Each clan had its own interests. While the country was being plundered, everything was fine with them. There was a lot to plunder. But the process of concentration of governance of productive forces is an objective process, and sooner or later there will be nothing to plunder. And when the clans had plundered the country, the borders of the plundering touched. So Lushkov began to crush the regional clans who couldn't understand why the Lushkov family wanted to take over everything. So there was, and is still, a mess in our country. The situation cannot be stabilized, although they are trying to stabilize it with the help of the state bodies, trying to democratize the country. But this does not work. Why? By virtue of the law of time. And if in the West capitalism took shape for centuries, and the people got used to the fact that gradually people got richer, then in our country they became billionaires within record time. Morgan made his fortunes for centuries. And in Russia, Abramovich and the other guys like him, who were entrusted with keeping the money, factually began to manage billions at once. And all this mess, generated by capitalism and the rampant race of consumerism, is no longer acceptable. Therefore, the global predictor made the decision to shift all of humanity into a harsh fascist regime. Now people are being brought to such a state of popular anger, in which they will hate their governments and overthrow them. After that, the global predictor will establish a harsh fascist regime. In this case, our millionaires and billionaires, who do not understand what games they are inscribed in, will become victims of the oncoming slaughter. This is the implementation of global politics. But it seems to our politicians and newly made wealthy guys that they are very smart and understand everything, but within the measure of their understanding, they work for themselves, and within the measure of their non-understanding, for the global predictor. But it is a blessing in disguise, and the bottom picture illustrates how Russia is distancing itself from this global mafia, and the latter, apparently, does not understand this, since it has lost control. Look what happened. So they ruled our country through the false ideology of Marxism. We had a Supreme Council and a government that implemented the plans of the global mafia. By the way, this scheme was presented at the parliamentary hearings in the Duma. So, when they introduced a multi-party system, having abandoned the power of the Communist Party, saying that no ideology can be dominant. In other words, the absence of any ideological authority is prescribed in our constitution. That is, there is a pluralism. Yeltsin took up the development of an ideology and entrusted this matter to Georgy Alexandrovich Satarov. We quickly handed Satarov the conception of social safety, and he quickly decided to quit his job and left the Kremlin. This is not a joke. This can be proved by chronological data. So, Satarov is an explicit agent of the global mafia. In the picture, you can see that the global predictor on all 6 priorities influences Russia, and in Russia there is the internal predictor, which also exercises governing impacts on all 6 priorities. And now the conception of social safety is becoming a means of gradual gaining by Russia of such power, which will subsequently transfer the governance over all mankind to the alternative conception, the private one, which the whole world unconsciously expects from Russia. But this will take some time. If we talk about reality, then in reality mankind should stably move towards humanness and the implementation of God's design on earth. This is the goal set by the highest hierarchical encompassing governance in relation to humanity. But what did the global predictor do? They set up a false goal, a soul bubble based on the conception and the ideologies expressed in it, and directed the movement towards this soul bubble based on the principle of divide, pit, and conquer. In practice, they subjectively ruled the objective process of concentration of productive forces of humanity, and they have led humanity to a dead end, to an absolute global system crisis in every sphere of life. If summarizing the whole history, then we will see that the entire history of mankind is a masterful withdrawal of people from the necessary path of development onto the false one, from the divine path to the path of Satanism, from the peaceful path of mastering the genetically determined potential to the path of struggle for survival. This cannot be called life. However, this ruling of the global predictor ultimately does not correspond to the all-encompassing ruling of God in relation to humanity. Therefore, the law of time is the start of stopping the satanic path. We are on the verge of global changes. Therefore, today, it is important to make your own vector of goals, objectives, correspondent to the vector of God's objectives. How is concentration of productive forces of humanity carried out? There are two ways. The first one is how the global predictor does it, the way of destruction. The second one is the preemptive method of inscription. How is the way of destruction carried out? How does the global predictor subjugate countries and nations? Quite simply, by using all 6 priorities of generalized means of governance. They destroy infrastructures, pit nations against each other, impose false ideologies as the truth, including religions, distortions of history. They destroy the education system, and under the influence of all that has been said, they subjugate the supersystem of humanity, or a particular supersystem, a particular people, nation, by setting their goals towards it. Having previously weakened this supersystem by means of all 6 priorities, there are no elements in the supersystem that could at least detect a factor affecting the supersystem, let alone respond to it. So they subjugate countries and nations. Thus, the supersystems begin to work towards the goals of the global predictor. By the way, one of those who quite strongly and competently opposed the global predictor was Stalin. But Stalin did not leave any heirs and did not achieve the measure of stability that would have made it possible to educate and single out a new Stalin in time. Why? At one of my lectures, I already said that Stalin had concepts, understandings of what we talk about in images. He realized how it had to be. But he did not have a terminological apparatus, and he was forced to use the terminological apparatus of Marxism, which does not, to the required measure, correspond to reality. Here is something else I'd like to point out. The fact is that both the conceptions, the previous one and the unprevious one, have always been present in people's lives throughout the history of mankind. One should not suppose that here, in Russia, they got together and worked out the conception of social safety from scratch. Nothing of this kind. These 2 conceptions have always existed. The satanic biblical one, which was terminologically formalized through the Bible, when they clearly expressed the dominance of some over others, and vested this conception with acceptable forms and implemented it. And there has always been the other conception, the previous one. After all, there have always been people who strove to live in harmony with each other, according to the Sophists, in harmony with God, with nature, with their neighbors. Basically, as history shows, this was the prerogative of ordinary people, not the elite. Therefore, among the ordinary people, this private conception was expressed in fairy tales, legends, epics, songs, proverbs, sayings, in the culture of mankind. This does not mean, of course, that every song, fairy tale, proverb was absolutely private. The proportion of privateness and mistakes in culture also took place, so it was somewhat blurred. I mean that the private conception was not expressed in strict lexical forms, since it was scattered in the folk epics of mankind, and of Russia in particular. But then, what is the merit of the authors of the conception of social safety Deadwater concluded in? It is concluded in the fact that everything that was expressed in the folk epics was set out primarily in the sufficiently general theory of governance, in a modern terminological apparatus quite adequate to reality. There are no discoveries there. Many people were familiar with many concepts before the appearance of the conception of social safety. But the most significant thing about the conception of social safety is that it is laid out in a systematic, strictly ordered way, so that it is very convenient to master it. Everything is gathered in one place, but not scattered. This means that the conception of social safety is not a discovery, but only a formalization of this conception, which objectively has always existed. If the global predictor formalized their unprivate conception over 3,000 years ago, then now in Russia, for the first time in the history of mankind, the private conception is formalized. Now, this method of destruction, by virtue of the law of time, has begun to work against the destroyers themselves. While the process of globalization was going on, it functioned successfully, that is, while there was someone to plunder. But when everything that could be plundered has already been plundered, then who to plunder? But the method continues to work, like all the previous over 3,000 years. This has become one of the reasons for the crisis. So now, in essence, when the process of the end of unprivateness through the law of time has been initiated, which inexorably and inevitably changes the world every year, the global predictor is failing. This method has begun to work against the global predictor themselves. And what is the method of the conception of social safety? The conception of social safety has a method of a preemptive inscription, that is submission to its interests without destruction. Otherwise, this method is called the principle of interception of governance. According to this method, one process of governance is inscribed by another process of governance. The method of preemptive inscription is characterized by the following: identification of objective and potential goals, one's own goals and goals of competitors. First, we need to understand what goals we have and what potential goals the global predictor has. Further, we enclose the governance centers of competitors towards ourselves in structural and structureless ways, and all the time we take care of establishing and maintaining the maximum depth of identicality of our and our competitors' vectors of goals, which leads to conflict-free governance without destroying structures, infrastructures, and the element base. In other words, we create a certain informational field. We begin to spread information about the private conception. And the more people begin to factually switch to the private lifestyle, the more the governance of the global predictor becomes conflict-free, inscribed into the vector of goals of the private conception. In addition, people begin to organize themselves into real structures to implement the conception in life. This leads to a situation where the competitor becomes dependent on our vector of goals, on our structures. What's more, the preemptive inscription inevitably accompanies the formation of subordinate intellect. So, we begin to exert an informational impact on people, elites, presidents, governments, telling them about the conception of social safety, explaining the main fundamental concepts. We also tell the elites that they are just a tool. We comment on the documents of the state, criticize them publicly and in essence, and so on. But most importantly, we use the informational influence to orient the elements of the supersystem to the vector of goals of the private conception. People usually think that they need to do something urgently, kill someone, eliminate someone in order to change something. But this is a method, by the way, of destruction. There is no creation. We are talking about the method of harmonious inscription without destruction. Moreover, it is harmful, and not only does it not solve old problems, it also creates new ones. Therefore, in order to change something, there is no need to break anything, gather for demonstrations, protests, and so on. We need to work now in a calm mode, mastering the new conception, revising our life, the life of our family line, country, humanity, modern culture, changing views on our values, priorities in life. Wherever we live, whatever we do for a living, we have to work in this direction. If you are an ordinary teacher at school, then haven't mastered the conception of social safety, you can include it into the general curriculum and give it to your students. We already have many examples of this kind all over the country. If you work this way, you, in essence, will intercept governance. Imagine if you tell children about the Trinity, the priorities of generalized means of governance, alcohol and nicotine, not from the standpoint of boring moralizing concerning the dangers of alcohol and the risk of choking on one's own vomit, but from the standpoint of the fifth priority of governance over countries and nations. Imagine if you tell girls how sexual intercourse with multiple sexual partners negatively affects future offspring, also about God and so on. What do you do in this case? You actually intercept governance over the satanic conception, since a certain percentage of children will not want to waste away their lives with cans of beer or just thoughtlessly for sexual pleasures and the alike. Such children will be more predisposed to think with their own heads and realize their genetically determined potential than their peers, deprived of this saving information. They will understand how they can be manipulated. They will much more adequately understand the news that is fed to people, and so on. Therefore, in this way, you, in fact, intercept governance. If you do such upbreeding with all this depth from childhood, when children easily perceive and absorb all this information, then you can deprive children of many problems and help them not to be puppets. And for such an interception, you do not need to wait for any orders from above. You don't need to kill anyone, any officials, and so on. Here is an example. There is such an Anatoly Georgievich Shipitsyn in Chelyabinsk, doctor of technical sciences, professor, engaged in serious scientific activities. He is the head of the Department of Systems of Governance. He reads all this to his students. Moreover, we have permission from the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation, according to which the conception of social safety can be read as courses and authors' programs. There are other examples. We have workshops in factories, where the heads of these workshops and their colleagues are told all this. After all, no one stops you from doing this. We also tell all this to the Russian government, the Duma, and so on. But they got hooked onto the Harvard project. So is there any doubt that there is not a single official or governor who would be as pure as a baby's tear? They plundered the country and therefore got hooked onto the Harvard project. And there are two ways out of this, either prison or deserved holiday. You see, nobody wants to go to prison. Also, they cannot refute the conception of social safety, and they don't want to admit its correctness, preciseness, and metrological consistency. Indeed, they face the question of nraviousness, what they will be in the new life arrangement, if they will remain bosses or not. This is a mental block. For this reason, the government deliberately hushes up the conception of social safety. The same goes for scientists. Just imagine, you are a scientist, doctor of economics. You have taught this economic nonsense all your life, received an academic degree, a professorship, respect in society, a high position, and so on. And now what? After coming across the conception of social safety, you have to admit that everything you have been doing all your life is nonsense. Again, this is a choice of nraviousness and a matter of your true priorities. If you are a добросовестный scientist or a researcher, then it doesn't matter to you what you will be like in terms of your status when you have understood the true essence of things. But if the true essence of things is not important to you, then you will definitely not wish to lose all those benefits and advantages of your status. In this case, you are not добросовестчес. These are questions of nraviousness and priorities, or in essence, a psychological question. Just think, is it really so scary to admit that you were wrong? There is nothing terrible about it, as you do not humiliate yourself or do not lose respect, as many subconsciously think. But on the contrary, you gain this respect. Therefore, you should not be afraid to admit your own wrong. So, the interception of governance can be schematically shown as follows. There is an object of governance, a subject of governance, a governing impact, a result of governance, feedback. How can you intercept governance? It is necessary to exert an informational impact on the object of governance, the subject of governance, to enclose the feedback to yourself, and through the informational impact, to build your own vector of goals. Thus, governance is intercepted in a structuralist way. But what is being done in relation to our elite today? In the terminology of the conception of social safety, taking a shot overstag is carried out in relation to the elites. What is this? In sailing, tacking is a maneuver by which a sailing vessel, whose desired course is into the wind, turns its bow towards the wind so that the direction from which the wind blows changes from one side to the other, allowing progress in the desired direction. So, if a sailboat needs to turn to the right by 90 degrees, then, in order to avoid overturning, the vessel first turns to the left by 270 degrees, then straightens the movement and goes straight. So, after tacking, the sailboat is on the needed course. So to speak, for the sake of safety, the sailboat makes a certain extra movement. Alexander Pushkin has a poetic image in his poem, entitled Egyptian Nights. Note the title. But only in the morning porphyry, aurora eternal will flash. I swear, under the mortal axe, the head of the lucky ones will disappear. This is said about those who wanted to sleep with Cleopatra at the close of their lives. This is exactly the same with our elite. They wanted to sleep with someone, and their heads are already gradually disappearing. And now tacking, a shot overstag, is being held in relation to Russia. In terms of the sufficiently general theory of governance, this maneuver is determined as follows. A shot overstag is a maneuver that returns an unstable system to a stable balancing mode. A shot overstag is one of the activities of conceptual power. A shot overstag is a periodically reproduced phase action. A shot overstag is a purification of structures of governance, based on the combination of collective subconsciousness and consciousness. The oldest maneuver in history, as we know, is the maneuver which was carried out through Julian the Apostate. When it was necessary to establish Christianity in the world, the elite resisted. So Julian the Apostate brought the situation to the point of absurdity. Then the elite followed him, began to return to pagan values, after which a severe elimination was carried out. Julian the Apostate was eliminated after he had burned the ships in the war with the Persians, and a tough Christian regime was introduced. Rome then was decaying and governance had to be restored. For this reason, Christianity was used. Generally speaking, this short overstack from the global predictor runs through the entire history of mankind. The elite does not understand what is happening, as it is involved in other things. And then it is eliminated and replaced with a new one. So, from these standpoints, let's have a look at the general cause in Russia in the 20th century. What was it like? Here you see a timeline. Russia was then in a certain balancing mode. Here you also see that in 1917 there was a loss of governance over Russia, and a period of governance over Russia by the inter-Nazi mafia, the global predictor, began. In 1926, an ideological victory over fascism took place, and thus the period of the formation of conceptual power in the person of Stalin began. In 1937, the restoration of the sovereignty of the USSR due to the elimination of the periphery of the global predictor took place. It was a period of personnel rotation, a period of the formation of national personnel, and the destruction of the periphery of the global predictor. From 1941 to 1945, it was the struggle and victory of the Soviet people over world fascism. Then, after the war, comes the period of restoration of the national economy. In 1953, there was a hidden coup d'etat, the physical elimination of Stalin and his associates. After 1953, a period of latent dual power in the country, unrecognized by society, began. It was between the representatives of the remnants of the leadership of Stalin's super-concern and the global predictor, influencing the USSR in a structural way on the basis of the US National Security Council Directive 20/1, dated the 18th of August 1948. Then the process carried on and reached the stagnation of Brezhnev, when the slaves did not work well in the mines, the plans were not fulfilled, and so on. Therefore, it was necessary to return the system to a stable balancing mode, and the elite was involved in other things. For this reason, in relation to the elite, the maneuver of short overstack was applied. How? The elite was involved in democratizing transformations. As a result, our elite of that time brought the situation to the point of absurdity in order to bring the people the idea of a harsh fascist regime. During the perestroika period of the 80s, the internal predictor of the USSR appeared, which put forward its own conception. In 1987, the periphery of the global predictor became more active, after which Russia entered a period of hidden dual power between the global predictor and the internal predictor of the USSR. The period of latent dual power is characterized by the phenomenon of conceptual non-determination, when two conceptions of governance are present in society. Just imagine, we are a supersystem with many elements. In the minds of the elements, there is one conception, which works towards achieving certain goals. And everyone is used to working towards achieving their goals. If another conception with a different vector of goals is fed into the supersystem, which begins to take over the minds of people, in this case, people get a split mentality. One conception says, You need to go there, and the other conception contradicts the first one and says that you need to go the other way. This state is called conceptual non-determination. You cannot be in this state for a long time. Otherwise, the system in your country will break. So, Russia is now in a state of conceptual non-determination. When one conception has come to an end, and the new conception, the conception of social safety, is just entering the minds of people. Which conception will win in this confrontation? You know, people under the influx of emotions often say, God is with us. But how can this be expressed in terms of the sufficiently general theory of governance? Look, the highest hierarchical encompassing governance has a vector of goals, and the followers of the conception of social safety also have a vector of goals. The depth of identicality of the vectors of goals is quite high. And does the vector of goals of the global predictor coincide with the one of the highest hierarchical encompassing governance? Who is more previous? Who will receive support from above? Moreover, it should be noted that it is not certain people who will win, but the ideas, the conception, since the ideals of the previous conception strongly coincide with the vector of goals of the highest hierarchical encompassing governance. A victory is inevitable. The question is just about the measure of bloodshed of incoming events. We want less blood, less suffering for people. And the speed of this process will depend on you and me, on us. If you wait and do nothing, then this process will be long and bloody. And if you do something, the process will go faster. In addition, the process of intercepting governance by the previous conception will take place without cataclysms, catastrophes, revolutions. Slowly but surely, reality will change irreversibly. Let's go back to the processes in Russia. So after a period of latent dual power, a period of exposure of this dual power of the internal predictor of the USSR and the global predictor in Russia begins. This will be followed by the moral victory of the peoples of Russia and the moral defeat of the opposition. Then comes the period of accumulation of the people's nervous energy. Then comes the period of elimination of the periphery of the global predictor, the so-called elite. The victory will be achieved by the method of preemptive inscription, without destructions, wars and revolutions, as I have already said. Here is an example. Putin says that we should join NATO. Do you understand why? What our patriots do not understand is that Putin acts on the basis of the method of preemptive inscription. That is, he states that we should join NATO and spread this information there. Isn't globalization over? Is it finished? The submarine has been assembled. Have pipeline connections and other types of connections on the submarine been made? Yes, they have. Russia is one of the submarine compartments. Can we isolate ourselves from the whole world and show everyone the fig? No, we cannot. Because the global predictor will always find a way to beat the rest of the compartments against Russia. For example, they may drop someone a hint, which implies that they do not live well because Russia does not want to share its gas with them. And then again, the problems will turn up. Therefore, we will not be able to stay within our boundaries. We must distribute this information to other countries. For this, it is necessary to join all organizations, the UN, NATO, and others, distribute their conception of social safety there, thereby creating conceptual non-determination. The best way to do this is through science, through world symposia, and this process has already begun. We have channels to Japan, China, and Harvard University. Summing up the processes taking place in supersystems and considering the processes of concentration of governance of productive forces of humanity, I should say the following. We are a supersystem that was introduced in the environment for the realization of the goals set by God, the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, in relation to humanity. In most general terms, it is the mastery by all mankind as a whole and every person in particular of the genetically determined potential. If the vector of goals of the supersystem does not coincide with the vector of goals of God, then the supersystem collapses. In order to come to an understanding of the vector of goals set by the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, it is necessary to make the vector of one's own goals deeply correspondent to the vector of goals of the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, so to say, to find a high measure of identicality. A high measure of identicality is achieved through mastering one's own sense of measure and considering processes based on the stability in terms of predictability. What will happen next? When the system has mastered its potential of development, it must move into a new quality. Mastering the next stage is possible only when the previous stage of development has been mastered. The measure of development cannot be overtaken. Therefore, the basis for the existence of the next generations can only be the mastery of the genetically determined potential of the supersystem, in which you and I live. For this reason, future generations of humanity will be based on what we, the current generation, will do. The tasks before us are of exceptional importance. This applies to all nationalities on planet Earth. We live in amazing times. We face unprecedented challenges. In order for the supersystem of humanity to be able to develop, master its genetically determined potential, and reproduce new generations stably, we must solve the primary task to change the conception, to switch to the previous one, in order to make our vector of goals correspondent to the vector of God's designs. And having mastered the potential, we have to prepare mankind to enter new, as yet completely unknown stages of development. This is what the historical mission is now for our generation, and in this sense, the conception of social safety, dead water, is of global importance for all mankind on planet Earth.